Sweet, yeah. So like Max said, I'm Will. I study psychology and sport and exercise science at Newcastle, and today I'm going to be talking about stress, coping, and performance. Coping with stress is one of the hardest parts of training and performing in sport. The two are highly intertwined. For instance, even Usain Bolt, with all his confidence, reports experiencing anxiety, worry, and frustration before major races and championships. So stress and anxiety are automatic responses to events that are actually meant to help us adapt and respond to a situation relative to our goals. Sometimes, however, that information can be detrimental to performance and can even result in the development of maladaptive training outcomes, such as burnout and overtraining. So research by Burton on elite athletes has kind of demonstrated this, and he found that high levels of anxiety correlated with lower levels of performance and self-confidence. Real life examples also further support this idea. For instance, in 2011, when an in-form Rory McIlroy bottled a 4-shot lead on the final day of the Masters to end up tied for 15th place. What is interesting, though, is 8 weeks after the Masters, McIlroy went on to win the US Open decisively, showing no signs of the stress and anxiety he'd experienced earlier in the year. So what changed? Well, it's possible McIlroy didn't experience the same levels of stress at the US Open as he did at the Masters. It seems much more likely he's used a variety of coping strategies to manage and alleviate any stress he was experiencing. Hence, sports psychologists refer to coping as a mediator of the stress response, in that the way an athlete copes with training-related stress determines whether that stress facilitates or debilitates their performance. As such, understanding which coping strategies an athlete intuitively uses and whether they're effective may help enhance their performance, particularly in high-pressure situations. Fortunately, research has already identified and categorized a wide variety of athletes' coping strategies into 3 main groups. Problem-focused coping refers to strategies that attempt to modify the problem at hand. For example, adjusting your golf swing during a round if you're slicing it a lot. Emotion-focused coping involves efforts to manage the emotional stress associated with a situation. And lastly, avoidant coping uses strategies to evade sources of stress. So when looking at these strategies in action, sports psychologists have also been able to quantify their effectiveness. Problem-focused coping has consistently been shown to indirectly improve performance by reducing an athlete's level of stress. The relationship between emotion-focused coping, avoidant coping, and performance is much more complex, however. They can prove effective and helpful in certain situations. For example, refusing to acknowledge fatigue during a 100-meter sprint, but in the long term, their use is generally regarded as ineffective and may even leave athletes at risk of long-term decrements in performance. That's kind of where my project this year looked at. I focused specifically on avoidant coping and whether it might predispose athletes to greater levels of fatigue, which in turn may increase their risk of developing overtraining syndrome, which is a maladaptation to training that results in long-term decrements in performance. And we found athletes who frequently used avoidant coping strategies reported significantly higher levels of both physical and psychological fatigue. And since fatigue is a marker of overtraining syndrome, it's possible athletes who frequently use avoidant coping strategies are more susceptible to its development and the decrements in performance associated with it. So what does this mean and how can we apply it to help athletes manage their stress and anxiety effectively? Well, since avoidant and emotion-focused coping are associated with both short and long-term decrements in performance, sports psychologists and coaches should look to discourage their use and aim to equip athletes with a range of problem-focused coping strategies, which can be deployed in combination to alleviate any stress. And lastly, these findings may be of particular importance for junior and student athletes who've been shown to heavily rely on avoidant coping strategies to manage not only stress related to training, but academic stress. and there's kind of a greater load on younger athletes. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
That was fantastic, and actually absolutely bang on 5 minutes as well. So timing wise, it was brilliant. Really interesting talk. Let's see if we've got any questions in the chat. Perfect. Okay, so Sam, if you would like to jump on the mic and just ask your question to Will.
Hi, Will. I was just wondering if you found any positive outcomes from avoidance coping mechanisms, or if it was all negative.
Yeah, well, my focus was very much on like the negative effects and like looking at whether avoidant coping would damage performance, or increase fatigue after training or a match. So I wasn't really looking at whether it could enhance performance, but like, yeah, I think it could do. Like it kind of says, like in certain situations when you can't do anything, like you can't change how good your opponent is. So sometimes you are just going to have to put it to one side. I think it's what athletes need. You just need a big range of coping strategies, and kind of you figure out what works for you.
Perfect. And could I ask, is there any problem-focused strategy? Sounds like problem-focused strategies is the way that coaches and athletes sort of need to go, because they're positively related to performance. Is there any examples of problem-focused strategies that you could give to coaches?
Well, like I guess a simple one would be if you've got like performance anxiety before a match, you could use like visualization or imagery to kind of sit down, imagine what it would be like to be there, and hopefully that'd help reduce your anxiety when you're playing.